To give a brief introduction, Dr. Banu received her Bachelor of Science from the University of Madras in India and her PhD in Zoology and Genetics from Duke University. Oh, here, I'll switch my camera over. I'm not a tech guy. So she is from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and she's the professor and chair of women, gender, sexuality studies in the College of Humanities and Fine Arts. And she is a renowned author. One of her books, Ghost Stories for Darwin, The Science of Variation and Politics of Diversity, was the winner of the Ludwig Fleck Prize in 2016 for an outstanding book across the breadth of science and technology studies. And her most recent book, Holy Science, The Biopolitics of Hindu Nationalism, won the 2020 Michelle Kendrick Memorial Book Prize from the Society for Literature, Science, and the Arts. And her breadth of knowledge on these subjects is incredible, and her bibliography is incredible, and we're very excited and honored to have you, Banu. And we're excited to hear your talk today on gender, race, and the practice of science. And with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Connor. Thanks to you and the conference committee for inviting me. I'm always excited to speak to audiences where people come from different places, because interdisciplinary conversations to me are the most fun. I think this is a smallish group, so I'm going to try to keep it interactive, and let's see how that works. And so feel free to interrupt me. You can just speak into it, because I may not notice the chat during it. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. So as Connor said, I began life as a biologist, and I think ever since I was young, I only remember a passion for biology. And so it was somewhere during the middle of graduate school that I got interested in gender studies. And in part, the interest came from my experiences within the hallways of science. And so in part, I'm going to track that during this talk. And I hope I will make a case for why we need to think about science not as this enterprise and knowledge system separate from the rest of the university, and why interdisciplinary work is really necessary if we want to produce better knowledge about the natural world. So I'm going to start with a little quiz of sorts. So what do people think? Do flowers have sex and gender? Kath just gave us a nice definition of sex and gender.
I unmuted for the room, so if anyone wants to chime in.
And anyone on the Zoom call, just yell out an answer.
I would personally say that flowers have sex, but not gender, would be my initial assumption.
Anyone else?
We get some agrees from the crowd.
Yeah, no, let's just give it a minute. Sometimes people take a while too.
Yeah. And also anyone on the call, you can type in the chat whether you agree or disagree, or if you have a different opinion, of course.
Actually, now that I think about it, learning about plants in elementary school, middle school, they teach you about how certain plants have male and female reproductive organs as a part of the same element, but I feel like I have never heard similar conversations applied to people. And now you bring this up following Kat's talk, because we realize that we don't talk about this in regards to people as much as plants.
Right. So, so indeed we, transport what Kat talked about, sort of a binary difference between male and female. And so given that over 90% of flowers, I mean, are hermaphrodites, we still talk about the male parts of the plant and female parts of the plant. And indeed, there's some people who talk about flowers having a gender in flowers that are what they call male sterile. So it's a hermaphroditic plant, but the so-called male organs are not functioning. So it's called a female plant or a male sterile plant. So there's a way in which we've exported sex and gender into the plant world, and we can talk in a bit whether they actually have sex and gender, and what does it mean that we talk about them with sex and gender. How about these? Do these have sex and gender? So one is a key, one are computer plugs.
I mean, I personally would say that they don't have sex or gender, but I know that a lot of the times these are all referred to as like the male or female component.
Correct. So we still talk about them in male and female. I think I think someone in the chat says that so people are trying to create other kinds of vocabulary, but still, I mean, last week I heard someone is like, oh, where's the male part to this, right? And these are particular assumption of what will be called the male part and what is the female part. And one could say that, oh, these are all quite innocent. And so a few years ago, I was at the, so what is this?
Satellite.
So it's the International Space Station. A few years ago, I was in DC at the Museum of Air and Space. And they told a story that during the Cold War, so there was a point at which, I think this was post-Cold War, Russia has a station, US had a station, and the astronauts wanted to meet. But the problem was neither Russia nor the US wanted to be the female. Right? So they had to create a contraption so that the two space stations could meet where neither Russia or the US would be the female. So we think of these as, relatively innocent, they don't matter. But, that's an example that says something about that it does matter, right? That there are assumptions about that being female is not good, being female is weaker. So you can think of many examples where we use a gendered vocabulary. And when we use a gendered vocabulary, there are all kinds of assumptions of power, of who is inferior, who is superior, that we are putting on, onto the world. And in some ways, you could say this was the first homosexual coupling in space, between these two countries. So my recent work that I've been working on is on, I'm thinking about what would it mean to decolonize botany? How do we look at the colonial roots of botany to think about how it has shaped this discipline? And one of the things that is, when you look at the history of botany, looking at male and female, the point when botany was becoming a science was the same time as when plants were were being sexualized, right? You see these two things happening at the same time. And so when you look at Linnaeus and his classification of plants, they are based on the nuptiae plantarum, or the marriage of plants. And so if you think of the plants, they talk about, he literally has, this is one husband and 5 wives, 2 wives and 3 husbands. The classification is based on a system of sex and of family, right? So when you look deeply into so much of biology and you look at where our vocabulary comes from, where our theories come from, they indeed come from these very, not only human-centered world, but Western colonial-centered worlds. And for the most part, at least my training as a biologist, I learned nothing of history. I learned nothing of the linguistic origins of my plants. And so part of being in women, gender, sexuality studies, reading about the history of science has been very revealing on where our ideas come from. And part of my work is figuring out, does it matter? Are these just words, or is there a greater system that we have brought along with it? And part of what I hope I will convince you is that they're not just words, they're worldviews that we have brought into science, and we are perpetuating those worldviews. And so we need to be reflexive and critical about the language and the theories that we've inherited to describe the natural world. So a very quick introduction to this field I belong to, feminist science and technology studies. And so when we talk about objectivity, and for the most part, we would all say that science is objective. The idea is that science is neutral, that we can be disinterested observers, we measure things, we can reproduce it, and we produce something called big T truth, right? It's not subjective knowledge, but truth about the world. And one of the part of what feminist science studies scholars, looking at the history of science, partly suggest that that science is in part claiming to do the God trick, that somehow scientists can stay apart from science, get apart from the world, and are able to somehow produce neutral, value neutral observations about the world. And part of the field is about saying this view from nowhere is really not possible. Scientists don't check their cultural biases at the lab door or at the entrance to the field and suddenly be able to keep that all outside and produce some neutral observation with the world. But rather that science is always situated. We need to be reflexive and accountable. And at best, we produce little T truth. And that has to, be that, people repeat it. And then if different sets of people repeat it that have different entrance points into it, perhaps we will produce stronger knowledge. And so this, in short, picture A, where we think of science outside of culture, that we need a model where we recognize that science is produced by scientists, and scientists are very much within a culture. And so they bring their cultural understandings and their cultural biases to the practice of science. So it should come as no surprise that for the longest time, women were not allowed into the hallways of science. Queer people were not recognized as individuals, right? It is social movements that have changed our understandings of human beings that has also subsequently changed scientific understandings. So science, if you look at social movements and scientific theories, they are also very intertwined with each other. Science was central to this understanding, for example, that women should not be allowed the right to vote or allowed into higher education. And one of the scientific theories that was prevalent at that time is that women, if they were allowed into higher education, all the blood would go to the brain and there would be no blood in their uteri and they would become barren, sterile creatures, right? This was a scientific theory. And it's important for us to not look at this past and say, oh, that was pseudoscience, that was bad science. Because very often these understandings of colonized people are lesser humans, it's okay to colonize them. Histories of slavery, the ways in which queer people and trans people have been always seen as perverse and marginal to society. These were all understandings that science has produced, right? And so we need to understand this picture B, that these were not bad scientists or bad science. Science is always embedded in culture. So this, I think, to me, this is a call to say that today, the science we produce is also embedded in our cultural understandings. And rather than pretend that that doesn't exist, engaging with those ideas, thinking about the history of our terminologies and our fields will help us produce better science, better accounts about the natural world, rather than pretending they don't exist. So halfway through graduate school, when there were a bunch of us who were beginning to think of, do questions of sex and gender and race matter, we came to the conclusion eventually that they mattered in lots of different ways. They matter in individuals, in the kinds of experiences we have, that a lot of us were individually feeling a bit insecure. And then when we started talking to each other, I don't know if this has happened with this group, you realize everyone feels like an imposter, this question of the imposter syndrome, right? That everyone feels that, oh, my advisor is going to find out, in my next meeting that I'm really not as smart as they thought I was when they admitted me. And it was just astonishing to us how widespread, that feeling was in graduate school. So it matters at the individual level, and especially those who have minority identities in departments feel excluded, feel in the margins. And this was some of what, Kath was talking about earlier. It matters in the culture of science. And so there's a wonderful book by Sharon Trawick, Beam Times and Lifetimes. It's, I think like 30 years old now, but she does ethnography. She's an anthropologist of high energy physics. And what she concludes is that high energy physicists argue that they have no culture. So she says her ethnographic work was a culture of no culture, right? So how does a culture function when it has no vocabulary to talk about how culture functioned? And so this was, I feel, at the heart of my graduate school experience as someone who always loved science and believed science was objective. It didn't matter who I was. It didn't matter who else anyone was. We would all produce objective knowledge about the world. But actually coming to graduate school, working in the hallways of science, you realize it matters. The hallway conversations, how classrooms function, what people talk about in the labs, all of these are part of how the culture of science functions. To give you an illustration, I was part of an NSF-funded project looking at how this culture functioned. And we had a group of male and female faculty and a group of male and female students. The faculty didn't know who the students were, students didn't know who the faculty were, and there were two of us that carried a conversation. So they talked to each other through us. In some cases, there were advisors and students, but they didn't know they were in each other's groups, colleagues and peers in their department. So what we asked them was, are there any unwritten rules that govern graduate school? So you get a handbook. Usually the handbook says you should have completed your oral exams or written, passed your certain set of written exams. Each department is different. Outside of that, are there any unwritten rules? And the graduate students had no trouble. They came up with a very long list, like graduate school is all consuming. All truth comes through confrontation. So the whole idea of how our classrooms worked is if you had to read a paper, you had to tear that paper apart. The person who was most critical was the smart student. And if you are able to do that, that implies competence. Hierarchy is to be maintained. Know your place in the hierarchy. Upper levels of the hierarchy control changes in the lower level. Be aware of what you wear and the image of your clothes project. So for example, I'm a field biologist. So if someone came dressed in too feminine wear, it's like, clearly you're not working very hard. You need to have some dirt around, and that's seen as a sign of competence. The following emotions are not allowed, insecurity, crying, personal problems. If you're a woman, family responsibilities will retract from your career. If you're a man, it's a bonus prize that shows your humanity and sensitivity. Helping others detracts from your personal achievements. Research is more important than teaching a course. When I was in an R1 university, so, they always said, if your advisor asks you what you want to be when you finish, you say, I want to be just like you. If you said you wanted to go to a teaching institution, you were not seen as a serious student. So almost all these things, when we ask them, why do you think, so for example, the idea of crying, why do you think crying is not allowed? One student said, we heard the story that 20 years ago, a woman faculty cried in a faculty meeting. So the fact that we're talking about it 20 years later is a sign that that's not an okay emotion. So students described a world where they were very attuned to what was being said, how different people were being treated, the stories that were being, passed along. And women students, had a different set of things, because we said, okay, so So you don't do any of these behaviors. And part of what they said is, no, we figure out how to live within it. So we don't cry in person, we cry in the bathroom, right? Don't show feminine, and anything that you're female, don't carry a purse. And for some people, this produced a really difficult quandary of, so let's say you're menstruating, how do you carry the tampon to the bathroom? The kind of detail they talked about of how to make, different aspects of gendered bodily functions secret was really quite astonishing. And in one of the departments, they talked about that there's a faculty member who walked around at midnight to see which students were still, around, and that these were stories faculty shared with each other. This is according to the students. So what some of them decided to do is they would have two backpacks. They would leave one backpack in their office, leave the light on, and then they may go out for dinner or go early for the day, right? So they found ways to get around these rules, but they were very, very aware that these rules existed. Female faculty had a different, set of concerns, that they could never show weaknesses. They had to be pleasant all the time. So they felt a different set. And I'm happy to talk more about any of this if you would like to. And finally, there was a lot of conversation amongst the male faculty in that group. And finally, this is what they said: there are no rules. And one of the faculty members in particular said he interviewed in shorts and slippers, that he really felt there were no bounds to who he needed to be, so long as he did good science. That's all that matters. And this was certainly nothing that the female faculty or the graduate students felt these were the worlds that they lived in. And so part of this I'm trying to give you is an example of how, if you look a little deeply, how complex the cultures of science are, and how students learn how this culture is functioning. And of course, for a lot of faculty, this came as a rude shock, because they felt these were not the kinds of labs where they were trying to produce. But students are not only living in the lab, they are watching how the larger department functions, how professional meetings function. And so this was really an invitation for the faculty to think, how do we open this conversation up to the department? How do we make it clear that it's okay? So for the most part, students would say, if I went for a movie on the weekend, I'm not going to come and talk about it, because that was seen as, you had time to go see a movie, right? To have other kinds of hobbies were not okay. So but faculty felt they wanted students to have full lives. So how do they create that culture? And this cannot just be ignoring that it exists, but an active way in which to foster the kind of world they felt they wanted to produce, but were clearly not producing. And so to me, one of the predominant metaphors that we live with, at least in the women in science literature, is this leaky pipeline question, right? And time and again, what the data suggests is that people leave not because they can't cut it, but because they find the climate inhospitable, or this is not the kind of life they want. This is not what they imagine for themselves in the future. And so for me, this whole idea in the women in science literature is, all we need to do is plug these leaks. And once we plug these leaks, people cannot come out. For me, the fundamental problem is the pipe itself, right? Why are we creating these dingy pipes? And when people are leaving, sometimes, I think I want to applaud it rather than force them back into these inhospitable spaces. So really, for me, the challenge has to be about, how do we create a metaphor other than these dingy pipes, representing what science does, and how can we make that climate hospitable so people want to stay and not leave? And I want to end with talking about one of the current projects that I've been working on for some time now, and it's an ongoing project, to give you an example that these questions of race and gender don't just affect the individual scientist, don't just affect the culture of science, they also affect the knowledge that we produce about the world. And part of what we have done in academia is really about creating specialized disciplinary silos. At least in my institution, we have the humanities, the natural sciences, and the social sciences. And the natural sciences are supposed to have nature, social sciences study society, and the humanities studies products of society. And each of these fields have their own methods, right? So fields are, they are defined by the objects they study and by the methods that they study those objects with. So fields like women, gender, sexuality studies and feminist science and technology studies really want to be that point in the intersecting point right in the middle, in that we think this is a false representation of the world. And while specialization allows certain kinds of knowledge, when all knowledge is only specialized knowledge, something is being missed because we are not seeing the interactions between these different worlds. And so it's really calling for interdisciplinary work that's not just between biology and chemistry, but between biology and women, gender, sexuality studies, between history and chemistry, that these other kinds of knowledges are also extremely important to produce an accurate representation of the natural world. So there's a famous French philosopher called Bruno Latour, and he puts it very well. What he argues is that what we have been doing is the top. We purified the world into these non-human worlds, human worlds, nature, culture, and as Kat talked about, these are binary logics. Binary logics are everywhere, white and black, working class, upper class, right? So if anything you look black and white, we have these. And similarly, non-human worlds, human worlds, nature and culture. And he basically says, we can purify the world all we want in our disciplinary silos in academia. But if you look at the world outside, there's work of translation happening, all at once. The natural world and the cultural world are deeply entangled with each other. If you take a case like climate change, that's a great example about the ways in which they entangled with each other, but yet the tools that we have in academia are very blunted because we are caught up in these disciplinary silos. So rather than thinking of nature and culture, science and society as separate from each other, we need to understand them as co-produced objects, as nature cultures. So if you take an idea like race, or gender, or sexuality, these are not stable categories. Even the number of categories within race changes over time because social movements change how we see people. Those change the science that we produced about race. And the history of eugenics is a great example, and that again shapes the society we produce. So our theories, our ideas are constantly moving between nature and culture, science and society, and back again, right? This is a dialectic process. So similarly, ideas of diversity or DNA or genes are all part of that. And this was the heart of the book Connor was talking about, Ghost Stories for Darwin, where partly what I show in that book is that the science of variation, all the key figures I studied in my classes and that I cited in my research on the history of evolutionary biology and population genetics, were deeply invested in questions of eugenics, right? And so when you look at it, the science of variation is very intertwined with the politics of diversity. Again, I can tell you more. So we like to think that women's studies and the sciences have nothing to do with each other. But when you track these histories, they have everything to do with each other. And this was something I certainly never learned in my classrooms. And it was so important to the ways in which my research has unfolded ever since. So I want to talk about the case of invasion biology as a case study of what is possible when we bring these fields together. So this is tumbleweed. And it is the icon of the American West. When I watched, Westerns, you'll always see this tumbleweed rolling down. And it is a sort of American icon of the Southwest, but yet it is not a native plant. It is, it emerges from Russia. So I got interested, why do some plants become native? And why do some plants remain, reviled and foreign? And when you look at these histories of native and foreign, again, you see a nature cultural history. How we talk about what is in place and out of place actually first emerges in botany by John Henslow in the early 19th century, when he was trying to categorize true British flora. So if you had to categorize that, then you had to categorize what was not true British flora. And our idea of native and foreign, and especially invasive species, that is so strong within us, this is not the world that has always been true. A little more than 100 years ago, for example, someone said, let's introduce every bird mentioned in Shakespeare into New York Central Park. And they did, right? So, and part of colonialism, people would say, is fundamentally an ecological project. What colonialism did was moved plants around, created plantations, monoculture of plantation crops around the world. Trees were cut in parts and moved into others. Things like Kew gardens were produced, botanical gardens were produced everywhere. And one of the signs of being upper class was to be able to bring these foreign plants, like orchids, especially, in one's living room. So part of the colonial period is really what I would call the original bio-invasion, where there was movement of the world biota across the world. And then one sees, as colonialism is being fought in different parts of the world and colonial countries have to come in, one begins to see the fruits of that, or the consequences of that. And then one begins to see, at least sort of within the United States, of laws that did not allow anyone who wanted to come into the countries, right? So various kinds of immigration laws. And again, what's interesting is the immigration laws come at the same time as laws about plants and animals. So again, the ways in which the foreign is constituted is a cross-species constitution. And this is one of the points that historians make, is that every time you have a period of xenophobia, you have the xenophobia not only against foreign peoples, but also foreign plants and animals. And so it spans species. So here is a children's book about alien species infested America. We start very young with these classifications. Another classic is the idea that there was an Eden before, right? Before the exotics and the invasives came, it was an idyllic place that these foreigners have transformed. At the heart of the fear of the foreign is a fear of the global. And it's this idea of the foreigners who are here. They're the weeds of the global garden. So globalization is really a key factor here. And I've been doing this for the last 20 years, and you really see a transformation post 9/11 as you begin to see Homeland Security emerge, the ways in which we now surveil plants and animals parallel how we surveil humans. And the vocabulary of fighting wars and battles, again, we do that with plants and animals like we do with humans. And again, this whole idea of borders being important, again, comes up within plants and animals, just as we do with humans, and the whole conversation about biosecurity. And part of what I've been tracking is how we talk about plants and animals alongside how we talk about humans. And we talk about the foreigners in very similar ways, as being unhygienic, looking weird, taking over everything, stealthy destroyers, being indestructible. And the oversexed female, which is again a real trope of third world women, as producing too many babies. Again, we think that about foreign plants as well. Fears of miscegenation, unlawful entry. And one of my favorite titles that I feel captures all of it is, they came, they bred, they conquered, right? Which is at the heart of how we think about the foreign. And again, this idea that when we have germ panics, foreign panics, histories of xenophobia, when we have one we have it across different species. And of course, this is a profound irony in the United States, because it begs the question of who is a native, right? And in this, in the ways in which this literature unfolds, the natives are really the white settler colonists who are the natives, not the real natives. So again, this recognition that this category of native is a political construction based on who is in power, not really who was native in this country. And it begs the question of, how do we define a native? 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, right? Given that the ecology and evolution of different kinds of life histories of plants yield very different ecologies, how do we decide what a native is? But yet, despite how ambiguous these questions are, we have a vast literature and fields of invasion biology. And my argument, would be that that this category of foreign and native is too crude a category to really help with the real problems of ecological devastation that we're seeing on the planet. That the real problems are one of development and overdevelopment of land that has been damaged. And rather than fix these larger problems, invasive species becomes a way in which xenophobia keeps us all occupied about trying to do something about the environment, which I would argue are not as productive as these deeper questions that we would like to. That we need to fundamentally, as we're seeing, right now with the World Summit, there are very, very deep questions about the inequalities that colonialism has produced that we don't grapple with, and these become easy ways in which we do that. But my argument would be that they have profound consequences, that the kind of xenophobia we promote, we are promoting across species, and they feed each other in the ways in which we think about the foreign. And so post 9/11, we see the ways in which even within environmentalist organizations, we see these ideas of green patriots, that environmentalists need to, take up arms in order to fight for the climate and the planet. And so in short, again, I'm using this case as a way to argue that first, these separations are artificial separation of what a native is, what an alien is. And secondly, if we want to truly combat the problems that we are experiencing in the world, we need to think nature culturally. We need to think interdisciplinary and bring the tools of the academy together in looking at the world. And I just wanted to give you a quick counterexample of a few years ago in Georgia, undocumented students used the butterfly, using the monarch butterfly as a model for a more borderless world. And so they wore these monarch butterflies on their wings, pointing out that the natural world often lives without national boundaries that humans have created. And so this gives us another way of thinking about the world. And that while within biology, we think of sex and gender and race and sexuality and nation, all these categories as biological categories, we need to recognize them as nature cultural categories, that they're really political categories. And the more that we recognize these histories, I think we will produce better science about the world and have better solutions for the world. So I will stop there, and I'm happy. I threw a lot at you, but I'm happy to take questions, talk more about any of the points that interest you.
Great. Thank you so much, Banu, for such an interesting and insightful presentation. I can start with a question while we let some questions come in through the chat and the Q&A, and maybe some folks in the room are thinking of some. But one of the things that struck me, especially, of course, as someone that is from Cold Spring Harbor, that you spoke about earlier, is that a lot of these cultural movements of xenophobia, or even just, cultural norms that are inherently toxic and have are rooted in some sort of scientific evidence, or not evidence, but scientific study or in science in general that had like more profound impacts than maybe originally intended. Now, so that's interesting, of course, to me, coming from Cold Spring Harbor, as you spoke about eugenics, and of course, you and I'm sure everyone here is aware, but just as a reminder, you know, eugenics was largely, as far as I know, you know, really driven through some members of Cold Spring Harbor as an institution in the early 1900s or late 1800s, I can't remember, but and one of the things that Cold Spring tried to do to kind of hold ourselves accountable is by making pretty much all that documentation as absolutely transparent as humanly possible, whereas we're not trying to shy away from that history to be, you know, not to say that we're not, you know, there's no like discounting it or anything, but there's a way to hold ourselves accountable is to make it as transparent as possible, where there's basically like a library on campus where you can open access public, you can come and see every notebook from all of those folks who are doing that. Is there a way more practically for institutions where it might not have been so centralized, where there was, you can make like a repository of stuff, like where institutions who may have harbored a study that led to profound consequences that might have been unintentional at the time, do you think there's a way for them to hold themselves accountable, or to kind of move forward with that without kind of sweeping it under the rug?
That's a really great question. And I think, you know, I'll say two things about it. One is, yes, kudos to Cold Spring Harbor. I use that, the digital archives, you know, when I teach as well. And we are, you know, I would say every day beginning to hear stories, right, of, you know, this university that still has bones of Native Americans, or, you know, other groups that were gotten without consent. You know, in there, there's some, you still use it for teaching, some are, you know, on in freezers. There was just, I think 2 weeks ago, about these photographs of someone at Harvard, right? So we're beginning to see a lot of that. And I would agree with you that I wish we would, that there would be an openness about, and both an openness, but also the question of reparations, right? Of returning things, of treating artifacts with the respect that the communities they came from would want to accord it. And so these kinds of conversations between, for example, Nathan. So now there's a law, you know, that says the bones of Native Americans have to be returned back to those communities, but all the other bones are legal, right? But how do we develop those kinds of, you know, ethical understandings? But I feel at the heart of it has really to be that we need to produce a better account of what science is and what scientists do, right? For the most part, we work within the frameworks of our time, and that we all need to acknowledge that that in our histories, there are some very problematic histories of the kinds of science that you know, have been produced. And so I think we need to fess up to that and be open to that. The second thing about eugenics is, this is one of the things I feel that historians of science have taught me, is science is very adept at changing the terminology. So we will not call it race anymore. We will call it population, differences between populations. And then it's the same old racism when you think of all the HapMap projects that we produce, right? So we're doing the same thing. We just have a new vocabulary for it. So, for example, we may not have state-sponsored eugenics as we once did, which, you know, at least the records at Cold Spring Harbor was a time when states produced laws that said certain groups of people could be sterilized. But now a lot of this has been turned over to the individual. But the consequences are similar, where we say certain kinds of bodies are undesirable. So currently now with prenatal testing, for example, the statistics I've seen is over 90% of fetuses are aborted. if they test positive for Down syndrome, for example. Is that not a form of eugenics? So the state isn't doing it. It's been privatized, but individuals are doing it. So I think we need to have, real, serious conversations of what welfare laws, who is forced to take long-term contraceptions, which parts of the world do we say should stop producing more children? All the population explosion logic is very racialized. So I would argue that what I would hope is, in addition to doing that we continue to track how those racist histories morph into modern day vocabularies that we all think is okay, but it's really the same thing in a different guise. And I think this is why I think these interdisciplinary thinking is really important, because certainly as a scientist, this was not stuff I was trained to do. It was something I had to learn to do. So how do we produce, better and well-rounded scientists that will think through these questions?
Thank you so much for your answer. That was very interesting. I agree. I think that this concept of the culture and science being intertwined and stuff is something that is a breath of fresh air for me, I know personally, to think about and think about how in a teaching program, how to incorporate that. Yeah. Dr. Abate, did you have a question or?
Oh, thanks. I really enjoyed your talk. I don't know if you know my colleague, Rebecca Hester at Virginia Tech.
Yeah, I know her work, yeah.
Because it really reminded me, she does work on migration studies and immigration, and it's linked this under this rubric of biosecurity and how people and germs are linked together. And I think that's such an important area of study to bring those things together. Yeah, and of course, the coronavirus and the sort of racialization and calling it the Chinese virus. This is not ancient history. This is something going on right now. So I just wanted to thank you for that talk.
Do we have any questions from the crowd? Yeah, we have a student here. I'm going to swap the video around to the webcam.
Professor Subramaniam, thank you so much for your talk and for your work in general. I really think that understanding how the scientific enterprise in general and science culture and knowledge is influenced and was shaped by the ideas we had, the even wrong ideas that we had of gender, and of race, can also help us to perhaps frame issues regarding gender discrimination or race discrimination as scientific ethics issues. And it always strikes me how we as scientists are very keen to call out issues such as fabrication of data or lack of transparency or whatever as scientific ethics issues. But why is it so hard to call out forms of discriminations as really scientific ethics issues? These are, issues that affect science culture. Why is it so hard? And do you have any suggestions on how to address that?
It's a really very insightful point, and I think you could make a stronger claim that sort of within science, ethics, I would say, are still at the margins of science. It's not only an ethics question, it's a foundational question. So when you're studying plants and you talk about male and female, or the cats, question of when we talk about humans and we only have two categories for sex. So it's not only an ethical question, it is we are ill-producing knowledge about the natural world. The why question, I think, is this has been the history of academia, right? That as long as this idea that somehow knowledge is apolitical, that we are producing pure knowledge, and questions like, gender studies, like all the stuff happening around critical race studies happening now, these all systematically get written as political. And so by engaging with it, then it is that science is political. And I would say science is political. The history of science, profoundly tells us who has been given rights and who hasn't been given rights, who has been seen as a human and who has been seen less as human. These are profoundly, political questions. But science never wants to be seen as political. So that would be my, and secondly is that we don't train people, right? None of us are trained to be able to think about ethical questions, to address those questions in our work. So it also means that we need a different kind of training in graduate school, different kinds of conversations, and we need to expand what scientific training means. And I don't know that we want people who haven't thought about these questions to suddenly start addressing them. It takes some kind, it takes interdisciplinary thinking. Because part of what I would say ethics has taught us is we may think we're doing the right thing, but it has all kinds of other consequences sometimes. So we need to be careful in how we go about it. So for example, the recent push in NIH that every study has to talk about the sex of whatever they're studying. So if it's a human being, you have to talk about the sex of that human being. And then if you're talking about a cell, you have to talk about the sex of the cell, right? And a lot of this came from feminist work early on, that we need to make visible, sex and gender and not pretend that they did not matter in biology. But then it got implemented in this really, I would say, problematic way. What does it mean to talk about a sex of a cell? And suddenly now if everything gets labeled male and female, we will start producing gendered language where it doesn't exist. Right? So all I'm saying is we need to think through what this happens. And I'm not sure that as scientists, we are trained to do that. So what you're pointing to is a very deep problem that's going to take a deep solution in bringing interdisciplinary teams to think about it and to reframe how we understand science and to retrain all of us to think more interdisciplinarily. But you are absolutely right.
Well, thank you so much. And I actually had another curiosity. So you mentioned how, yes, indeed, science is political, and you mentioned it also when you talked about your book. And I was curious, really, in knowing about what were the key insights that you got while reading, the literature around studies of natural variation, and from Darwin to the rest of the 20th century population genetics, and how does the politics of science come into place there?
So the heart of the book is really about, that within the cultural world in women, gender, sexuality studies, we think about this term called diversity. Within evolutionary biology, we talk about this term called variation. And for me, these had been two completely different worlds. And I had not recognized they connect with each other. And this is what the whole book is about. And so the book is really about saying these are completely connected. They're not only connected with the terms diversity and variation, but they're connected because the history of these terms are deeply intertwined with each other. The history of eugenics is really grappling with the relationship of these questions of variation with questions of diversity. So for example, do we want to, so we think of for the most part, when we think of eugenics today, we think of Nazi Germany. But eugenics was a much broader term early on in its history. And there were, people of all political stripes who were trying to use science to produce a better society. And that's the idea of eugenics, right? How do we produce a better society? And what people wanted, their imagination of a better society varied considerably. Some people said, we only want the best of people. We need Beethovens and Einsteins and Mozarts and, the cream of the crop. That's what we need to produce. All the people with lesser genetic stock should not be allowed to reproduce. Others who said, no, we want a diverse population. We need to value heterozygosity, and that a population that is diverse has the resources to adapt to different kinds of changes in the environment. And so a population with great variation is the better population than this brilliant population. So this was a fundamentally biological and cultural debate on how we should think about questions of variation and diversity. And so that's part of what the book is all about, is how nature and culture are not separate. Variation and diversity are not separate in what these terms mean today and how they have come about historically. That in both those, these are deeply intertwined questions. And yet the way we teach them and the way in which we do science and the humanities, we put them in completely different realms. And that's really too bad, because there's a great loss in the kind of disciplinary silos we have created in academia.
Are there any other questions from the room? I don't think so. And I don't see any questions down below. I did have one more, not really a question, but almost like a comment, and maybe you could speak a little bit more about it. I will say that I may have to run out and grab the Panera bread, so I might not be able to be on the face cam for the answer to this. But something that interested me is, we always talk about the leaky pipeline, and I really like the way you phrased how maybe it shouldn't be a pipeline to begin with, and it's like this. It's an unfortunately accurate depiction, but how to change that to something different. And maybe you could just expand on what you see as a better route than that, because, and in addition, I know you were saying a lot of the point around that was that if you stuff those pipes and keep it from leaking, you're just kind of forcing people to stay in this hostile environment. But also just the metaphor of it being this kind of rigid old leaky pipe is kind of not, like I said, it resonates with all of us, but maybe it shouldn't. Maybe just a comment and maybe speak a little bit more on that.
Sure. So the pipe, at the heart of the pipe, please go get your Panera bread. That's just fine. I don't want all of you to go hungry. So the whole idea of a pipeline is really that you isolate it, right? And that's, for me, number one, is how do we create a science that is not isolated, that is connected with the real world, that is connected with other disciplines, that's connected with people outside, that's connected with politics, right? So sort of one is that. And second is really, how do we create a climate that people want to stay in? So all the data suggests that groups that leave because they say, I don't want to do this, not that I cannot do this. They often have very good grades, right? But they just see this as an increasingly not very fun activity. As a tenured faculty, as a, let's say an academic track, you have to be getting grants all the time. You have to mentor your students. You have to get postdocs. Then you have to be presenting, writing papers, leaving very little time to actually do the thing you love doing, which was to be out in the field, or to actually do bench science. And so there have been a lot of studies looking at narratives of people who say that it's just become very, very difficult and it's not very fun anymore. The second is this very sometimes racist, sometimes very masculinist climate of how you become that top-rate scientist, how you need to act, how you need to be, which for some people is a real turnoff. So how do we create these climates where different kinds of people are welcomed, and it's okay to be in different kinds of way. And there isn't just this one role model we're all supposed to follow. And, very often we may have women role models, but sometimes the women role models look, act just like the men. So that's, a fundamental critique of what WISE programs have done is they've created networking and they, cheer you on. But the model you're supposed to become they're very similar. They're just different kinds of bodies, but they all act the same. So how do we create true diversity that allows people with different viewpoints, with different life histories who act in different ways to actually thrive in science?
Thank you for your response. Again, I feel like both with your talk and your responses, I just feel like the key term has been insightful. And I want to thank you so much again for being one of our keynote presentations today and for giving us such an amazing talk. And yeah, I saw Andrea Moffat said, thank you for the different perspective on the leaky pipeline metaphor. Very insightful talk indeed. And I think with that, we can wrap up the first portion of the retreat. And I know we all thank you again, Dr. Banu,